Hello. Chapter 4, Week 4, recapping my unexpected autism and ADHD year. In last week's video, available up here, I talked about how it's okay to have a freakout after realising you've been autistic all along. The later in life you realise you're autistic, the more you've probably masked and done some damage to your sense of self and self-esteem, the bigger the freak out you'll probably have. We're going to put that freak out in the background for now. It's normal and it will probably sit with you for quite some time, retreating into the background and popping into the foreground again over weeks and months as you get used to being the new you. For this week, the focus is on being proactive and moving forward, looping back to the question that I posed back in chapter 2, the what now, after you've either self-diagnosed later in life or suspect you might be autistic but want to be sure. Some people are super happy remaining self-diagnosed and think a label adds absolutely nothing to that self-knowledge, and that's absolutely fine. I get that. For me, almost immediately, I 100% wanted to be sure and wanted to get a formal diagnosis. A lot of autistic people hate ambiguity, and I'm one of them. And sure, I'd done the self-test, scored high, started Googling, recognised it, realised it was me, but I wanted 100% certainty. I didn't care about the label so much as the professional opinion that I wasn't going down a random blind alley and was just seeing things about myself that wasn't there. Because my mental health was on a bit of a spin at this point anyway, and I genuinely didn't know whether I was imagining things. I wanted a formal diagnosis. For me, it was the only way to be sure I wasn't losing my marbles. In retrospect, I would have waited a little longer before diving in, but I'm also impulsive. Hello, future ADHD spoiler. So getting a diagnosis, or even being told I wasn't autistic, it was something else like OCD that made me so routine and list focused. It became all I could focus on. Some of the advantages of getting a formal diagnosis include validation, although you don't need to be diagnosed to see and understand your own lived experience, obviously. Some autistic people welcome the diagnosis as a way of making sense of their life experiences and being able to identify with other autistic people. A diagnosis can help you, your family, your partner, your colleagues, your friends understand why you might experience certain difficulties and what you can do about them. A formal diagnosis might also correct a previous misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis is massively common, unfortunately, for autism diagnoses that were missed earlier in life, and as a result it can get you better or more focused mental health support. Much as I referenced neurotypical self-help books being quite damaging for neurodivergent people in the previous video, a lot of undiagnosed neurodivergent people get mental health, for example, anxiety support with tools or techniques that don't take into account their autism, and can also do more harm than good, trying to live up to an ideal that's not right for our brains. What else? A diagnosis may help you get access to appropriate services and benefits. A diagnosis may help women who tend to mask more, and those with a PDA demand avoidant profile, which again we'll get into in a future video, who may not have been previously recognised as autistic by others. But possibly most importantly, if you work or study at least, you'll be entitled to have reasonable adjustments made by your employer, college or university. If you've got a good employer or school, a formal diagnosis may not be necessary to get adjustments put in place, but with one, they have a legal duty of care to make adjustments for you, and a formal diagnosis can obviously help with that. So, how do you go about getting one? I'm conscious this is UK focused and will be different in different parts of the world, obviously. So I won't linger too long on specifics, but briefly for a UK audience, some local authorities you can self-refer, but generally you'll have to go through your GP, and that can be and is a postcode lottery. A lot of GPs, a lot of healthcare professionals in general, in fact, don't have an in-depth knowledge of autism, unfortunately. So you will have to do a lot of your own research and fight your own corner. This should not be the case, but it is. You will have to be your own biggest advocate. And when you're not even 100% sure you're autistic, that's a big ask and is massively stressful. So we're segueing into some of the cons now. The healthcare system, at least in the UK, is really not set up for neurodivergent people, and you may have to fight hard for yourself. If your GP doesn't refer you for an assessment and doesn't think you present as autistic enough, for example, some BS reasons I've heard from others, like, but you make eye contact, you've succeeded academically, you've succeeded professionally, you don't look autistic, you can ask to see a different GP or even make a complaint. Hopefully you won't have to think about these sorts of things and you'll get the support you need from your local medical provision, but just that heads up, you might have to be pushy to get heard. And if you're a typical atypical, you probably generally don't like to be pushy. But if you're going to put your battle armor on for one thing though, put it on for this. More cons of getting a formal diagnosis are, do you need the label or is it enough just knowing? There's still a lot of stigma and judgment. Having what's still classified in some areas as a disorder may well mess with your self-identity. The pathologizing language that gets used will often sound like a medical textbook and won't sound like your real life lived experience. People unfortunately will see and treat you differently with a formal diagnosis, and that can be really upsetting. So diving headlong into navigating language, like the medical model of understanding autism versus the social model of understanding autism, let alone the absolute minefield of self-identification language and person-first language and differences between early diagnosed and late diagnosed autistic experiences, can be exhausting and overwhelming when you first start getting into this whole new terrain. Diving into all this right at the start of your journey, particularly if your mental health's already a bit fragile, could pitch you into a full-on stress breakdown or autistic burnout, as it did for me after a few weeks. More future spoilers. A counterpoint to these warnings is, if you've masked your whole life, getting a diagnosis at the point your self-identity kind of collapses and you're incapable of masking anymore, is probably as good a time as any to get a diagnosis. Like, bring your whole self to the appointment room, to the assessment room when you're at your lowest ebb. Just embrace the car crash and go all in. Why not? I'm being slightly flippant, but to reiterate, negotiating a formal diagnosis can be a horrible process, and it is worth being upfront about that. It can also be a stupidly expensive process if you can't face a months long waiting list time and decide to get a private diagnosis more quickly, like I did. So ask yourself, do you have the energy for it in your life right now? Be comforted by the fact that autistic self-identification rates seem to be very, very high. If you're pretty convinced you're autistic and identify with what you're reading about, there's a decently high chance you are. What I would say, just to wrap up, if you don't immediately know whether getting a formal diagnosis is right for you or not, it's probably not a bad idea to get some counselling with a counsellor who knows about autism or neurodivergence, and Google is your friend here. But your healthcare provider locally may be able to help signpost too. And just take the time to think and mull and reflect about your next steps. But also get yourself onto a waiting list early if you can face it. And believe me, you'll have enough time to change your mind. The wait here, at least in the UK, for an assessment, unless you go private, is months and months and months. So you've got time to mull and find out more and work out whether it's what you want or not. Anyway, I hope that's given both sides of the coin a decent airing on whether to pursue a formal diagnosis or not, at least immediately after self-diagnosing. Hit my subscribe button, the little Saturn, if you're interested in continuing on the journey through my autism and ADHD year and the highs and lows of it all. And hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Cheers.